Welcome back. Okay, today we are diving into what is honestly one of the most fascinating historical experiments I have ever seen. Picture this for a second. What if you had a digital time machine, a way to step right onto the battlefield of 1815, tweak the decisions of one of history's absolute greatest military commanders, and just watch how it all plays out? Well, we don't have a literal time machine, sadly, but what we do have in this explainer is actually the next best thing. We're looking at a 1996 military combat simulator that was used to scientifically test Napoleon's greatest failure. Could Napoleon have won Waterloo? It's kind of the ultimate historical mystery, right? For literally centuries, people have asked if alternate tactical decisions on that exact fateful day could have completely rewritten European history. What if the French had used totally different tactics? Or what if they had committed their reserves differently? Well, instead of just sitting around debating it in an armchair, a team of researchers decided to actually test these what-ifs using modern computational power. And honestly, what a team it was. This 88-page technical report was a totally unique international collaboration. You had these French cadets from the St. Cyr Military Academy teaming up with the systems engineering and history departments over at West Point, and they didn't just write some dry, theoretical paper. No, these academies painstakingly researched and modeled the exact organizational structures, the weapon ranges, and the specific tactics of both the French and British armies, all to scientifically test Napoleon's options. So, to set the stage here, let's just do a super quick refresher on the immense pressure of the 100 Days campaign. Going back to March 25th, 1815, England, Austria, Prussia, and Russia basically signed a treaty pledging over 500,000 men to completely destroy Napoleon, whom they actually called the Ogre. Knowing he was massively outnumbered strategically, Napoleon took the offensive on June 15th to try and split the British and Prussian armies. Fast forward through the bloody engagements at Ligny and Quatre Bras on the 16th, and then a massive thunderstorm that literally turned the ground into a muddy nightmare on the 17th. Well, the stage was finally set for the climactic showdown on June 18th at the ridge of Mont Saint John, the Battle of Waterloo. Now, our time machine for this experiment is called the Janus system. Named after the two-faced Roman god, this definitely wasn't some basic 90s video game. It was a highly sophisticated ground combat simulation used by both the US and French armies for real-world tactical training. The researchers fed it digitized terrain from the Defense Mapping Agency to flawlessly recreate the exact hills and valleys of Waterloo. But here's the crucial part. Janus is stochastic. That's a fancy way of saying it actually uses the laws of probability and chance. It's factoring in weapon ranges, rates of fire, basic loads, and the exact probability of hits and kills for every single musket, saber, and cannon out there on the field. It's wild. A clash of tactics, Napoleon versus Wellington. Before we can actually run the simulation, we have to program the historical rules of engagement. Because at Waterloo, you didn't just have two massive armies colliding. You really had two completely opposite military philosophies going head-to-head. On one side, you have Napoleon. He was all about mass and aggressive offensive power. He loved psychological shock, sending forward these massive columns of infantry, and using heavy shock cavalry to just absolutely break the enemy's will. But on the other side, the Duke of Wellington. Wellington was methodical. He famously used the reverse slopes of the terrain to essentially hide and protect his men from artillery fire. He preferred these autonomous divisions and deployed his infantry in thin, two-rank lines to maximize their musket firepower. Basically, Wellington knew he absolutely could not afford massive casualties, whereas Napoleon was gambling the whole shebang on a quick, decisive victory. Which actually brings us to the ultimate defensive countermeasure that Wellington used against Napoleon's aggressive cavalry. Check out this original diagram from the researchers' report showing the famous British infantry square. A British square is essentially a defensive battalion formation of about 500 men, forming a 4-deep box with roughly 60-foot sides. It was explicitly designed to repel cavalry, and this perfectly illustrates why it was an absolute nightmare for horsemen. The researchers calculated a really fascinating logistical reality here. If you take a standard French cavalry squadron, so about 120 horsemen, and they charge the square, realistically only about 18 men in the very front rank of that cavalry could actually physically engage the square at any one time. Think about that. If that front line fails to break in, the guys behind them are basically just stuck there. The entire shock value of this massive cavalry charge gets instantly neutralized by simple geometry. Testing 4 alternate scenarios for the French army. So with the terrain digitized and these tactics hard-coded in, the researchers zoomed right in on the decisive phase of the battle, 1600 hours or 4 p.m. Historically, this is when Marshal Ney led massive, completely unsupported cavalry charges directly into those impenetrable British squares and totally failed to break the line. So the researchers asked, what if Ney had done it differently? They programmed 4 specific scenarios into Janus to find out. Here are the 4 what-if courses of action they tested out. Number 1, they simulated the actual battle, so just the cavalry charging the squares. This was really just a baseline to make sure their model was accurate. Number 2, they gave the French control of La Haye-Sainte, which was a super key piece of terrain, and used artillery to support the cavalry. Number 3, they brought in the French infantry divisions that were historically just sitting totally idle in reserve, using them to support the cavalry. And finally, number 4, the ultimate combined arms attack, using cavalry, infantry, and artillery all together in one massive frontal assault. I mean, surely throwing everything they had at the British would crack those squares, right? Let's see. Okay, this simulation data reveals a pretty incredible story. First off, if you look at the top, the actual historical losses were incredibly close to the simulated baseline in Scenario 1. That basically proves the Janus system was super accurate. But watch what happens in the alternate scenarios. When the French committed more forces, like, say, adding those idle infantry reserves or trying that massive combined arms frontal assault, their own losses actually spiked, peaking at well over 7,500 casualties. I mean, these aren't just random statistics on a screen. They are essentially tragic confirmations of massive historical blunders. The loss-exchange ratios here really reveal the grim reality of the math. This ratio is basically measuring Allied losses compared to French losses. Now, while adding infantry and artillery did increase the raw number of Allied casualties, it didn't proportionally benefit the French combat effectiveness at all. In fact, in Scenario 4, that big combined arms attack, the loss exchange actually dropped slightly compared to just using artillery. Why? Because the French were bleeding troops so heavily by just marching their infantry right into the teeth of the British defense. Throwing more forces at the problem literally just led to more slaughter. The illusion of control, why Napoleon still lost. This brings us to a pretty devastating final analysis for anyone who hoped Napoleon could have somehow pulled off a win that afternoon. The simulation proves that his fundamental strategic assumption was entirely flawed. It was essentially an illusion of control. Let's break down exactly why. The simulation repeatedly showed that adding those idle infantry reserves did, sure, increase Allied losses, but at a terrible, terrible cost, heavily spiking French casualties. Because even with infantry and artillery support, the French forces still could not physically penetrate those 4 deep British squares. They just couldn't do it. Furthermore, the simulation proved that capturing La Haye-Sainte to bring up artillery, while definitely helpful, simply wasn't strong enough to degrade the combat power of the British infantry holding that ridge. The ultimate conclusion? A frontal attack was mathematically doomed from the start. The computer showed that a synchronized flank attack was really the only viable path to a French victory that day. This brings us to the researchers' final, powerful conclusion in their executive summary. They wrote, faulty tactics will not prevail, even though the fighting force is enhanced with numerous combat multipliers. It is a profound realization, isn't it? Literally no amount of raw power, extra troops, or massive artillery could fix a fundamentally broken tactical plan. And I think it leaves us with a really provocative thought. In our own lives or our own projects, how often do we try to force a failing strategy by just throwing more resources at it, instead of stepping back and realizing we're basically charging headfirst into an impenetrable square? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the impossible.